Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive with us.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be looking at the Moneyball A's.
Right.
Really trying to go beyond just the, box scores and kind of the typical Moneyball stuff.
Right, the basic stats.
Exactly. And really look at some of the human elements and the stories behind how Billy Beane and his team kind of revolutionized baseball.
Absolutely. And really, it's amazing to see how a small market team with limited resources was able to compete.
Right, they had no money.
With those big market teams like the Yankees.
The Yankees, yeah.
Red Sox.
Yeah, so they had to come up with a completely different approach.
Yeah, and it was really fascinating the way that they went about it.
Absolutely. So let's start with, I guess, kind of setting the scene right. So the early 2000s, you've got the A's.
Mm-hmm.
They're, a small market team. They're facing these financial constraints. They just can't compete with the big boys in terms of, spending money on free agents.
Right.
So they have to find another way to be competitive, and that's where Billy Beane comes in.
Exactly.
This, former player who becomes the general manager and just really challenges kind of the accepted way of doing things in baseball.
And it's important to remember that this didn't just come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Before Beane, there was Sandy Alderson as GM.
Right.
And he was really open to some of these newer ideas about using statistics and data.
Like sabermetrics.
Yeah, sabermetrics, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So he kind of laid the groundwork for what Beane would then do.
Right, and then you've got the influence of Bill James kind of looming over all of this.
Oh yeah, Bill James is a legend.
The godfather of sabermetrics.
Exactly. He basically challenged everything baseball thought it knew about evaluating players.
Yeah, he was like on base percentage is king.
Yes.
And all those old fielding stats, they don't really tell you the whole story.
Totally. And he was really critical of how much weight teams put on those traditional scouting reports.
Yeah.
The gut feelings.
Right, the eye test.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because when teams first started trying to implement James's ideas, it was kind of a disaster. Yeah, there's a story about Mike Gimbel, who was the Orioles GM.
Okay.
And he read James's book and became obsessed with on-base percentage.
Oh, wow.
He basically told his scouts to ignore everything else. Just find guys who could get on base no matter what.
Like, didn't matter how they looked, if they could hit.
Didn't matter how they ran, how they fielded.
Wow.
Just get on base. And the result was this really strange team full of these misfit players.
Oh, that's interesting.
One of their picks was this guy who had been a rodeo clown.
You're kidding!
I'm not kidding. And another guy who raised caimans, which are like these small crocodiles.
No, so it was a total mess.
It was a mess. It was like James's worst nightmare, like people trying to apply his ideas without really understanding them.
Yeah, taking it to the extreme.
Exactly. And James actually got so frustrated with all this that he kind of gave up on baseball for a while.
Really?
Yeah, he even wrote, "It is a wonderful thing to know that you were right and the world is wrong. Would God that I might have that feeling again before I die."
So he was pretty disillusioned.
Yeah. But little did he know that Billy Beane and the A's were about to prove him right.
Okay, so let's fast forward to the 2002 draft.
All right.
You've got the A's, they're sitting in their draft room, which is described as this pretty Spartan space, cinder block walls, framed posters of past A's greats.
Yeah, nothing fancy.
No, nothing fancy, just focused on, getting the job done.
Mm-hmm.
And their mission is to find these hidden gems, these undervalued players that other teams are overlooking.
And they had a really interesting approach. They were actually looking for players with what scouts called bad makeup.
Bad makeup.
Yeah. Can you believe that?
That's crazy, especially when you think about how much emphasis is placed on character in baseball.
Right, exactly. But to the A's, bad makeup can mean a lot of different things.
Yeah, what did it mean to them?
Well, sometimes it meant players who questioned authority.
Okay.
Or guys who didn't have this stereotypical look of a star.
Ah, I see.
Sometimes it even meant players who had off-field issues.
So basically anyone who didn't fit the traditional mold?
Exactly. They were willing to take risks on these guys if their data suggested they could contribute on the field.
So they weren't afraid of players who were a little different?
Not at all. In fact, they sought them out. They saw those quirks as potential advantages because it often meant those players were overlooked and undervalued by other teams.
So they were looking for those diamonds in the rough.
Right. And that's how they were able to build a team of talented misfits who could compete with anyone.
Okay, so to really understand this strategy, we need to look at some specific draft picks.
Yeah, let's dive into some examples.
Let's start with Nick Swisher.
Okay.
So Billy Beane was obsessed with this guy.
He was.
The A's even launched something they called Operation Shutdown.
Operation Shutdown.
Yeah, basically they were trying to keep other teams from realizing just how much they wanted Swisher.
Wow. So they were playing some serious draft room poker.
Yeah, they were all in on this guy, and there was even this tense phone call with the Mets GM when it looked like they might draft him first.
Oh man, that must have been nerve-wracking.
Yeah.
They really wanted Swisher.
They did.
And then you have the story of Jeremy Brown.
Okay.
He was a catcher, and scouts said he had a bad body.
A bad body.
Yeah. They thought he was overweight and not athletic enough to make it in the majors.
Wow, that seems pretty harsh.
It does, right? But the A's weren't looking at his physique. They were looking at his on-base percentage and his hitting ability.
So they saw the potential that other teams missed.
Exactly. Their scout, Billy O, even had to convince Brown of his own worth, telling him to shoot for a six-figure signing bonus.
Imagine that a player needing to be convinced that he was good enough.
It's crazy,
Yeah.
right? But it shows you how much the A's believed in their data.
And Brown ended up having a really successful career.
He did. He proved those scouts wrong and showed that you don't have to fit a certain mold to be a successful baseball player.
That's so inspiring. It shows you that sometimes the people who are overlooked have the most potential.
Absolutely. And remember Steve Stanley.
Steve Stanley.
Yeah, he was a really undersized center field. Once again, the A's disregarded his physical limitations because they saw a guy who consistently got on base.
They didn't care how tall he was or how fast he ran.
Nope. They just wanted guys who could get on base.
And that was their key to success.
It was a revolutionary approach that challenged the very foundations of how baseball had always been played.
So the A's draft room was this fascinating clash of old school scouting and Billy Beane's radical data-driven approach.
Yeah, you had scouts scratching their heads, wondering what Billy was doing while he was busy proving that there's more than one way to build a winning team.
It must have been pretty wild to be a fly on the wall in that room.
It would have been amazing to see those discussions unfold.
Absolutely. And speaking of looking past appearances, let's talk about Chad Bradford, the Submariner pitcher.
Ah, Chad Bradford, what a character.
I mean, the guy threw underhand.
I know, it's crazy, right?
Talk about a unique style.
He was definitely one of a kind, and he was quirky too. Superstitions disguised as routines, a lucky rock, you name it.
Yeah, he sounds like a fascinating guy.
He was. But the A's didn't care about any of that. They saw his effectiveness and understood that his unusual style made him undervalued.
It's like Kent Tekulve, that sidearm pitcher for the Pirates back in the 70s.
Yeah, those unconventional deliveries can really throw hitters off.
Absolutely. And in Bradford's case, it's important to understand Voros McCracken's DIPS theory.
DIPS theory.
Yeah, which stands for Defense Independent Pitching Statistics.
Okay, I think we need to break that down for our listeners.
Yeah, it's basically the idea that pitchers have very little control over what happens once a ball is put into play.
So it's like a salesperson. They can control their pitch, but they can't control whether the customer buys or not.
Exactly. That's a great analogy.
So how does this relate to Chad Bradford?
Well, DIPS theory challenged the traditional view of pitching and made Bradford's ability to generate ground balls even more valuable because ground balls are more likely to result in outs.
Ah, I see. So the A's saw the value in Bradford that other teams missed because they were looking at the data through a different lens.
Exactly. And Billy Beane was absolutely thrilled to get him. He even said, because of the way he looked, we thought he might be available to us.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It just goes to show that talent can be hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to recognize it.
So this is all about challenging assumptions and finding those competitive advantages that other teams are overlooking.
Precisely.
It's incredible how the A's were able to build a winning team by thinking outside the box.
They were true innovators, and they weren't afraid to go against the grain.
But it wasn't just about acquiring players, it was also about managing them, which was a whole other challenge.
Oh, yeah. Billy Beane was very hands-on, constantly making trades and maneuvering to get the most out of his roster.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was constantly buying low and selling high, always working the phones and making deals.
Always on the hustle.
Oh, yeah. There's this crazy story about Ricardo Rincon,
Rincon, yeah.
left-handed relief pitcher. Imagine this. You're in the middle of a game,
Okay.
and suddenly you find out you've been traded.
Oh, wow.
That's exactly what happened to Rincon. Billy traded for him mid-game.
What?
And it happened so fast that Rincon almost had to pitch immediately after switching uniforms.
That's insane.
I know, it's just wild.
Mid-game trade.
Just shows how Billy was always thinking ahead, always trying to find an edge, even if it meant shaking things up in the middle of a game.
Yeah, he was not afraid to make a move.
Not at all. But all this wheeling and dealing it created some tension with Art Howe.
Oh, right. Art Howe, the manager.
Yeah, Howe was more of a traditionalist, and they often clashed over strategy.
That's got to be tough, right? Having the GM and the manager kind of at odds with each other.
Yeah, it definitely created some friction.
I bet.
There's this famous incident with Adam Piat.
Piat, yeah.
Young outfielder. He bunted to advance a runner.
Okay. Pretty standard play.
Right, totally normal in traditional baseball. But afterward, Howe questioned Piat about why he didn't swing away.
Really?
It turned out that Billy had told Piat to bunt.
Oh, so Howe was not happy.
Not at all. He felt undermined.
Yeah, I can see.
It just highlights this fundamental shift that was happening in baseball.
Right. The A's were at the forefront of this revolution, challenging the way the game had always been played.
Exactly. And that brings us to Billy's near move to Boston.
Oh, yeah. He almost left the A's to manage the Red Sox.
Can you imagine?
It's kind of ironic considering his success was built on doing more with less.
Right. He was offered a huge contract, but ultimately turned them down.
Why do you think he did that?
Well, there are a few theories. Some people say he didn't want to work for that ownership group.
The Red Sox ownership at the time, yeah.
Yeah, they were kind of notorious.
Yeah.
But I think it was more than that. I think he just wasn't ready to leave the A's.
He had built something special there.
Exactly. He had this vision, this project he was building, and he was determined to see it through.
So it was more than just a job for him. It was a mission.
Absolutely. And his loyalty to the A's paid off. In 2002, they went on that incredible 20-game winning streak.
Oh, yeah, that was historic.
It captured the attention of the entire baseball world.
Everyone was talking about the A's.
But that streak also brought a lot of pressure.
I bet every game must have felt like a must-win.
Yeah, the intensity was incredible. And even Chad Bradford, Mr. Unflappable, had a meltdown on the mound during that streak.
Really? Bradford, the guy with the lucky rock?
Yeah, even he couldn't escape the pressure.
Wow. It's a reminder that no matter how much you prepare, how much data you analyze baseball, is still a game of human beings.
Exactly. You can't predict everything.
And despite that incredible streak, the A's ultimately fell short in the playoffs.
Yeah, they lost to the Minnesota Twins.
Heartbreaking.
It was a tough loss, but it also raised a lot of questions about whether their data-driven approach could truly win a championship.
It makes you wonder if there's a limit to how far you can go with just data.
Yeah, maybe you do need that intangible clutch factor that can't be measured by statistics.
Right, the heart, the grit, the whatever you want to call it.
Exactly. It's an ongoing debate in baseball. But even without a World Series title, the A's forced everyone to reconsider their assumptions about how the game should be played.
They changed the game forever.
They really did. Teams started paying more attention to on-base percentage walks and avoiding outs.
So the A's were pioneers, paving the way for a new era of baseball analytics.
Absolutely. And one of the key figures in that shift was Scott Hatteberg.
Hatteberg, the catcher turned first baseman?
Yeah, he was a perfect example of the kind of player the A's targeted undervalued because he didn't fit the traditional mold.
He wasn't flashy, but he was incredibly smart and knew how to work the count.
He was all about process over outcome. He didn't just swing for the fences. He studied pitchers, waited for his pitch, and focused on getting on base.
And the A's, unlike his previous team, the Red Sox valued that patient approach.
Exactly. They understood that getting on base any way you can was the key to scoring runs.
So it's not just about hitting home runs, it's about getting on base any way you can.
Right. And it's fascinating to compare Hatteberg to Jeremy Giambi.
Jason's brother.
Yeah, who was also competing for playing time at first base.
Okay.
Giambi was a talented hitter, but more of a free swinger.
So he didn't have that same plate discipline as Hatteberg.
Not quite. And it sometimes frustrated Billy.
I can imagine.
And then you have Miguel Tejada.
Tejada, the shortstop.
Yeah, incredibly talented, but had a tendency to swing at everything.
He was aggressive.
Oh, yeah. Billy nicknamed him Mr. Swing at Everything. There's this hilarious scene where Billy's watching a game in Art Howe's office.
Okay.
And just loses it when Tejada swings at a bad pitch.
Oh, man, I'd love to have seen that.
It's classic Billy Beane, just totally exasperated.
So even with talented players, there were still clashes between philosophies and approaches.
For sure. And it highlights the challenge of managing a team full of unique personalities.
Absolutely. And speaking of data, let's talk about that little video room the A's had.
Oh, yeah. That room was like their secret weapon.
It wasn't fancy, but it was where the real work happened.
Exactly. Players would study their at-bats, focusing on pitch location and swing decisions. They even had charts tracking how often each player swung at pitches outside the strike zone.
So they were using data not just to acquire talent, but also to improve the players they already had.
Precisely. They created a culture of learning and self-improvement, where players were encouraged to understand their own strengths and weaknesses.
That's awesome.
They were always looking for an edge, even in the smallest details. There's this anecdote about David Justice.
Yeah, the veteran outfielder.
He was complaining about a bad strike call.
Okay.
He was watching the replay and arguing that the umpire couldn't even see that part of the play because of his positioning.
So they were trying to understand the game from every angle, even the umpire's perspective.
Exactly. They were leaving no stone unturned in their quest to gain an advantage. And that brings us back to Billy Beane, the master of the deal. Always working the phones, making trades, trying to find that perfect piece to complete the puzzle.
He was like a chess master, always thinking a few moves ahead.
Exactly. And, it's interesting to think about some of those players we've been discussing and how their careers might have been different if they hadn't played for the A's.
Yeah, like what if they had ended up on a team that didn't believe in them or didn't know how to use their talents?
Take Jeremy Brown, for instance.
The catcher with the bad body.
Exactly. He faced a lot of criticism for his size.
It's hard to believe that in professional sports, someone's physical appearance could be held against them so strongly.
I know, it's crazy, right?
But the A's saw past that and focused on his talent.
They did. And Brown definitely delivered on the field.
I bet those scouts who doubted him were eating their words.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But, even with the A's support, Brown still had to deal with the negativity.
I can imagine that must have been tough.
Some people even called him a great baseball player trapped in a bad body.
Oh, wow. That's harsh.
It is, right? But Brown had a great attitude about it.
Really?
Yeah, he had a really good sense of humor, and he had a great teammate in Nick Swisher.
Swisher always seemed like a fun-loving guy.
He was, and he was always there to support Brown, to remind him that performance was all that mattered.
That's what teammates are for, right?
Absolutely. And Brown had this great moment in the Arizona Fall League.
Okay.
He hit a home run that he initially thought was a triple.
So he was hustling?
Oh, yeah. He was running so hard that he tripped and fell between first and second base.
Oh, no. Was he? Okay.
He was fine, just a little embarrassed.
I bet.
But when he looked up, he saw the ball clear the fence.
So it was a home run after all.
It was, and his teammates in the dugout were dying laughing.
I can imagine.
But it was that good-natured laughter that comes from shared joy, not mockery.
Right. They were laughing with him, not at him.
Exactly. It's just a great story about how Brown turned those perceived weaknesses into strengths.
He embraced his unique style and proved that you don't have to fit a certain mold to succeed.
And it speaks to the A's philosophy of finding value where others didn't see it.
They were looking for guys who could contribute in their own way.
Exactly, and they created an environment where those players could thrive.
It's really inspiring to see how these misfits and underdogs came together and achieved success on their own terms. So what are some of the biggest takeaways from this whole Moneyball saga?
Well, for me, it's the reminder that even in a sport as steeped in tradition as baseball, innovation is possible.
The A's showed us that you can challenge assumptions, embrace data, and trust your instincts.
Exactly. And you can achieve some remarkable results.
It's all about finding those new ways of thinking, those unconventional approaches that can give you an edge.
It makes you wonder what other innovations are out there just waiting to be discovered.
That's a great point, and I think the A's also reminded us that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that nobody expects.
Those underdog stories are always the most inspiring.
They show us that anything is possible if you believe in yourself and your vision.
Well said. And for Billy Beane, it wasn't just about winning games, it was about changing the game.
He wanted to prove that his way, this data-driven approach, could work.
And he did. He left a lasting impact on baseball and beyond.
So the Moneyball A's left us with a legacy of questioning, exploring, and always searching for a better way to play the game.
And they showed us that sometimes the most unlikely heroes can achieve extraordinary things.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. I hope you found it as fascinating as we did.
It's been a pleasure, and remember, there's always more to discover, more to learn, and more to question.
So keep digging, keep exploring, and keep that curiosity alive until next